Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at another video from Answers in Genesis Canada. This one is about why dating methods are often inaccurate. And if I were to guess, my guess would be that they are mostly only inaccurate either when a researcher is attempting to figure out the limitations of a particular dating method and so is pointing out scenarios in which that method won't work, or when a creationist is taking advantage of these known limitations to date samples using the wrong method, or while not accounting for known contamination, or dating xenoliths or something like that. So let's see!
Much of the controversy between evolutionists and creationists concerns the age of the Earth and its fossils.
In other news, studies have found that water is wet. Actually, that's not quite true. Technically speaking, water is not wet. It makes things wet by sticking to them. But you know what I mean.
Evolution, depending as it does on pure chance, requires an immense amount of time to arrive at anything remotely approaching the integrated complexity that we see in even the simplest of living things on this planet.
That statement is mostly true, but evolution doesn't rely on pure random chance. There is a certain degree of randomness involved, but natural selection is itself a very much non-random process.
So, for over 100 years, geologists have attempted to devise methods for determining the age of the Earth consistent with evolutionary dogma.
No, you got it a little backwards there. For over 100 years, geologists and other scientists have devised methods for measuring accurate ages, and the ages that they ended up measuring just so happen to fit in with the time frame needed for evolution, as one might expect if evolution is actually true. To briefly summarize, in the 1600s, Steno formulated his laws of deposition, which led to Robert Hooke concluding that the fossils in these layers indicate that the Earth has a history that, in his words, far antedates even the very pyramids. So he didn't put a date on it, but he recognized that the Earth is older than human history. Then canal building started in the 1800s, which led to the discovery that strata can be correlated across vast distances, and this correlation led to the discovery of nonconformities, periods of time that are missing in between certain strata. This led James Hutton to formulate his theories of cyclic deposition and uplift, the beginnings of the rock cycle. Hutton concluded on the basis of the rock cycle that the Earth is not only old, but infinitely old. But here, scientists knew that the center of the Earth is hot, and so people like Lord Kelvin, for whom the temperature measurement degrees Kelvin is named, determined that the Earth's age had to be finite, as it can't just stay hot forever. This led to calculations of the age of the Earth based on how quickly it would take to cool, which had Kelvin concluding that the Earth is between 24 and 400 million years old. Now, it is important to note that there wasn't really anything approaching consensus on the matter at this time. There were vigorous arguments back and forth about whether the Earth was indeed as young as Kelvin calculated, or if it were actually infinitely old. Kelvin did eventually win this argument, but his measurements were off. He didn't know about radiation. Radiation changed everything. It now allowed for a heat source that could extend the time it would take for the Earth to cool off considerably. Well, actually, to be fair, Kelvin's calculations also suffered from the fact that he assumed a constant efficiency in passing heat through a gradient throughout the Earth, but if the heat moves more efficiently through the materials that make up the core of the Earth, then that would extend the age of the Earth by a potentially very large margin. But that's kind of beside the point. With radiation, we now have another source of heat that keeps the Earth warmer for longer, and on top of that, we can use it to directly date the rocks themselves, to measure how much time has passed between now and when the rock last solidified. Before radiometric dating came along, many different methods were used to date the Earth, but all of them contained some pretty serious flaws. The salinity of the ocean, for instance, failed to account for the changing rates of salt deposition over time. Radiometric dating eventually led us to narrow in on the current age for the Earth, which is approximately 4.5 billion years. It's not likely to change from here unless some future discoveries are made that end up overturning the majority of what we know about geology. So anyway, that's a very quick and oversimplified history of how we've figured out the age of the Earth. You'll notice that evolution didn't factor into the discussion at all. Now, certainly there were scientists in the late 1800s that used evolution as evidence that the Earth had to be older than Kelvin's estimate, but that was by no means a mainstream opinion.
Now, understand that when Darwin's Origin of the Species was published, the Earth was scientifically determined to be about 100 million years old.
Well, that was one of the mainstream opinions on the matter, but there were still plenty of geologists around at the time that were advocating for an infinitely old Earth. So, rather than presenting it as though it was firmly believed by all to be 100 million years old, it would be more accurate to say that it was a range from 24 million years to infinity and beyond. Sorry, I just saw the trailer for the new Buzz Lightyear movie and couldn't resist. If they think they're gonna trick me into watching it just by using an epic remix of Starman for their trailer, then let me tell you, they're probably right. I love the trailer even though I could tell it was blatant manipulation, and I'll absolutely watch what is going to inevitably be a mediocre backstory movie. Yes, I know that people like me are what's wrong with cinema nowadays. Back to you, Calvin.
But by 1932, it was found to be 1.6 billion years old.
I actually can't find that number in any of our date estimates, but I don't see a precise date for when we figured out that the Earth was 4.5 billion years old, but I'll just grant it for argument's sake. This is exactly what science does. As it gets better and more precise tools, we can use those tools to take better and more precise measurements, all the while performing better and more precise calculations on those measurements. So while in the 1800s the generally accepted age of the Earth was about 100 million years old, you could still find plenty of well-respected scientists advocating for much older ages. But as time went on, there was more and more agreement until basically all the scientists working in relevant fields now agree that the age of the Earth is 4.543 billion years old, plus or minus 50 million years. The fact that, off the top of my head, I could name the majority of the scientists in relevant fields who disagree with that assessment says something about the strength of that consensus.
In 1947, geologists firmly established that the Earth was 3.4 billion years old, and finally in 1976 they discovered that the Earth is really 4.6 billion years old.
Not rediscovered or discovered, but rather honed in on the correct age. And no, it wasn't 1976. There are papers from the 50s that peg the age of the Earth at 4.5 billion years old. But remember, science is generally progressing this whole time. This would be like measuring the length of something. At first, we don't have any measuring tools, so this thing is one of my fingers long. But different people have different sized fingers, so they get different measurements. So we standardize and cut a stick that will be the agreed upon length that we will call a finger. But sometimes we need to measure things that are smaller than a finger, or don't come out to exactly one finger. So let's use something like, say, a barleycorn to make regular markings on the stick that we will use to get more precise measurements.
Okay, let's start small. Line up some barleycorn.
What, but won't they all be different sizes?
Do I even have to say it, Jason?
Say what?
Shut up, Jason!
Time goes on, and eventually we get to today when we can use lasers and whatnot to get very precise measurements that have to be expressed in negative exponential terms. So this thing that you could say was 1 finger long at the beginning, you can now say is 1.173424, etc. fingers long. This doesn't make the initial measurement wrong, it just makes it less precise than the revised measurement. It was the best measurement we could get with the available technology and scientific knowledge of the time. It's the same thing with the age of the Earth. As we develop more accurate and precise methods of measuring the age, the accepted number for the age of the Earth started getting closer to the actual age of the Earth. This whole thing just appears to be an offshoot from the creationist argument that science is wrong because it keeps changing, when in reality, we can trust science because it does change when new information comes to light.
Now, these dates indicate that for 100 years, the age of the Earth has doubled every 20 years. And if this trend were to continue, the Earth would be about 700,000 trillion years old by the year 4000 AD.
Maybe, but why would we expect that trend to continue? And in fact, it hasn't continued. If the age of the Earth was first calculated to be 4.5 billion years in 1956, which is the oldest paper that I can find that gives that number, then using your trend of doubling the age of the Earth every 20 years, that would mean that the accepted age of the Earth should have doubled 3 more times since then, which would place it at 36 billion years old today. Even if I assume you were right when you said we got it to 4.5 billion in 1976, which you were most definitely not, then the accepted age today would be 18 billion years. But 4.5 billion is still the accepted number, even now, 65 years after it was first calculated. I mean, it has shifted a bit. In 1956, Claire Patterson calculated it to be 4.55 billion years old, and today the accepted number is 4.543 billion years old. Almost like they weren't just doubling it every 20 years, but were instead honing in on a more precise measurement, with the changes in measurement becoming less drastic as they get closer to the actual number. To go back to our measuring with fingers analogy, if the item being measured was 1.173424 fingers long, an initial measurement using fingers as the smallest possible unit that we can measure would place it in between 1 and 2 fingers long. Once we added the barleycorn into the mix, we can now say that it is longer than 1 finger, but shorter than 1 finger and 1 barleycorn, and since there are about 3 barleycorn in a finger, it's actually 2.625, but at this stage we can't measure that precisely, then that means that we've knocked 2 barleycorn off the measurement. That's a lot. But the next time a smaller unit is developed to measure it, there aren't another 2 barleycorn that can be knocked off, so the difference between the actual length and the measurement will never be as drastic as it was in the early days of measuring. Now, obviously this isn't a perfect analogy, there are some pretty big glaring flaws, but it's close enough to make the point.
However, all of this is based on selected data and certain assumptions that might not be true.
In the case of the age of the Earth, the assumption is that everything in the solar system formed at roughly the same time, an assumption that appears to be valid. And keep in mind here, when I say the same time, I'm talking about the entire 50 million year period that it took for the solar system to form. Given our current models of solar system formation, the inner rocky planets, which include Earth, would have been some of the last objects to form, while the outer planets would have formed first. So it's likely that Neptune is 4.59 billion years old, while the Earth is 4.54 billion years old. But there are some unknowns in there that leave some uncertainty on the age. So the Earth is 4.54 billion years old, plus or minus 50 million years, so it's possibly as young as 4.49 billion years, or as old as 4.59 billion years, but we know for a fact that it is in that range, and the way we get there is by dating meteors, rocks that have been floating around in space and have been solid since the formation of the solar system. For radiometric dating, the thing that we're really dating is the last time the rock was molten. So for a meteor that's been isolated in space for the entire time since the formation of the solar system, it will date to the formation of the solar system, which would include the Earth. But how do we know that the meteors we date didn't melt at some point in their history? Well, if they did, that would effectively reset the clock, making them appear much younger than they really are. So if there were some event that melted all the meteors that we've used thus far to date the Earth, then the end result is that this event happened 4.5 billion years ago, and that would mean that the Earth is actually much older than that. So even if I grant that such an event could have affected so much of the solar system without leaving a fingerprint, it doesn't help the creationist case.
And as we'll see, selected data and unprovable assumptions are a problem with all methods for determining the age of the Earth and dating its fossils and rocks.
Bet she doesn't mention isochron dating.
Now, the most widely used method for determining the age of fossils is to date them by the known age of the rock strata from which they're found.
I don't know if I would agree that that's the most common method, but that is certainly a method, yes. If you have robust data dating the strata in an area where you are finding fossils, it is a safe assumption that the fossils in those strata can be dated to the same ages as those strata.
And on the other hand, the most widely used method for determining the age of the rock strata is to date them by the known age of the fossils they contain.
Well, again, I'm unsure if this would be the most common method, but there are certain organisms that are easy to identify for which we know their date ranges. So if we're not sure of the age of a layer of rock, and we find a particular fossil in it for which we already have robust dating data for that species' temporal range, then we know that that rock has to date to a time when that organism existed.
Of course, this is an outrageous case of circular reasoning.
If those were the only methods used, and both the dating of fossils with rock layers and the dating of rock layers with fossils were used in the exact same location and with the exact same species of fossil, then yes, that would be circular reasoning. But like I said, there needs to be robust dating data for one of these items that comes from other sources before either is accepted. And my understanding is that usually using index fossils for dating rock layers is seen as a method for getting a preliminary estimate for the age, which will be figured out more precisely with other methods later.
And geologists are well aware of the problem.
It would actually be way more shocking if geologists were just somehow completely unaware that using those two dating methods to the exclusion of all other methods would be problematic.
As a matter of fact, J.E. O'Rourke, for example, conceded this in the American Journal of Science. The intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling the explanations are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings results.
That quote is the first sentence of the article Pragmatism versus Materialism in Stratigraphy. It's not a particularly well-written article, and I'm not going to read through the whole thing to try and parse out what point he was trying to make, but really, the main problem with using this quote to point out that using index fossils is circular reasoning is right in the quote as AIG presents it, feeling the explanations are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings results. In other words, it's not saying that using index fossils to obtain dates is actually a circular process, it's pointing out that to a layperson who isn't intimately familiar with geology, it appears to be circular, and geologists hadn't up to that point bothered to give an explanation aimed at laypeople as to why it wasn't circular reasoning, instead just being satisfied with the fact that it works. So this isn't a criticism of the practice of using index fossils, it's a criticism of geologists who didn't seem to be concerned with explaining why it works, leading to creationists like you using it as an example of circular reasoning when it's not.
You see, in the circular dating method, all ages are influenced by evolutionary assumptions about the date and order in which the fossilized plants and animals are believed to have evolved.
Nope. There is way more to it than that. Only fossils that meet certain very specific criteria are used as index fossils, so not just any fossil will end up being used to date the rock layer. And when we date the rock layers using other methods, we see the pattern of evolution. If the dates had come up differently, then the index fossils would be used for different dates than they are. We don't reorganize them to make them fit with evolution. Besides, doesn't AIG accept the general order in which the fossils appear? Aren't there a bunch of articles on AIG's website attempting to explain why the fossils appear in this order? So, if we all agree on what order the fossils are in, why would you complain that sometimes we use the known order of fossils in relative dating methods? Isn't that exactly what AIG does when they say that certain species died in the flood earlier than others? Sure, they get the time frame completely wrong, but it's still a relative dating method. It's just relative dating done poorly.
Now, most people are surprised to learn that there is, in fact, no way to directly determine the age of any fossil or rock.
Well, that's just not true. Igneous rock can be, and is often, directly dated. Metamorphic rock can be directly dated, but it's more difficult than igneous rock because the process of metamorphism can take a long time, and so there will be crystals within the rock that are different ages. Sedimentary rock is more difficult still, but sometimes it can be dated directly. Electron spin resonance dating can be used on rocks, fossils, and artifacts that are less than 1 million years old, and it's most definitely a direct dating method. Now, we are currently 2 minutes and 58 seconds into this video with 2 minutes and 58 seconds left to go. So at exactly the halfway point of this video, the only dating method that Calvin has brought up is the use of index fossils in stratigraphy, and he doesn't seem to have even a basic understanding of how they work. This does not bode well for the rest of the video.
The so-called absolute methods, radiometric methods, actually only measure the present ratios of radioactive isotopes and their decay products in suitable specimens.
Pray tell, Calvin, where do these isotopes and decay products exist? In the rocks that are being dated. It's not some external thing, they are literally a part of the rock. No naturally occurring rock is perfectly pure. There are going to be things mixed up in whatever material is forming the majority of the rock. These things are a part of the rock when the rock forms. So to measure these things is to measure a property of the rock itself. So yes, this is directly dating the rock.
Not their age.
Their age is a calculation based on these measurements. The better the measurements, the more accurate the age calculation.
These measured ratios are then extrapolated to an age determination. And this extrapolation is based on the fact that an unstable, a radioactive, chemical element called the parent isotope breaks down at a presently known rate to form a more stable daughter isotope.
A presently known rate that is not known to be capable of changing. We have good reason to believe that decay rates are constant, and we have zero reason to believe that they are not.
But surprisingly to many, the most commonly known by lay people, radiocarbon dating, C14 dating, is actually of little use to evolutionists.
Carbon-14 dating is of great use. But I suppose it depends on how we're defining evolutionist here. That seems to be a word that creationists use flexibly to just mean whoever I don't like at the moment, because I imagine that most scientists who make use of carbon dating accept the theory of evolution, and so could be called evolutionists, but I think you're trying to cast doubt on geologic ages here, so I feel like this iteration of the word evolutionist is aimed at geologists or paleontologists, who, while they do still use carbon dating, use it less frequently than, say, an anthropologist or an archaeologist.
First, no rocks and relatively few fossils contain measurable quantities of carbon of any kind.
Limestone, coal, diamonds. These are 3 examples of types of rocks that contain large amounts of carbon right off the top of my head. In fact, the majority of the carbon on the Earth is stored in rocks. So you might have meant that they don't contain detectable amounts of carbon-14, but you explicitly said that they don't contain measurable quantities of carbon of any kind. At best, this is just an example of you being massively ignorant, and this can only hurt your case, as any creationist that uses this video as an educational tool will be shown very easily to be demonstrably wrong by anyone who knows what a frickin' diamond is.
And second, because of the short half-life of C14.
Yeah, carbon dating is only useful up to a maximum of usually 50,000 years, with the possibility in ideal scenarios of dating items up to 100,000 years old. And actually, the usual maximum is being extended to 55,000 years, thanks to an update to the radiocarbon calibration curve that was just published last year. This is one of those things that creationists like to pretend will be devastating news to anyone who accepts evolution, because for evolutionary timescales we need to go back millions of years, which is what the other dating methods are for. This is one of many. And on top of that, if carbon dating were the only reliable dating method that we had, it would still be enough to conclusively disprove young Earth creationism, on account of being able to date things consistently and reliably that are tens of thousands of years old. Well, if creationism were true, we wouldn't be able to date anything older than 6,000 years, because there wouldn't be anything older than 6,000 years.
The radiocarbon method can only date specimens up to about 50,000 years of age.
Which is 8 times older than what would be possible if young Earth creationism were true. So, thanks for proving my point? Though, surely he'll get around to explaining how the flood did something to mess up the dates, whether it be changing the decay rate of carbon or adding extra carbon. Depends, but no matter what, if something changed during the flood that made all of our dating methods agree with high levels of accuracy on old ages like they do, then that had to be God doing that on purpose to make the Earth look older than it is. Why would God behave deceptively like that? But also, now that I've seen to the end of the video, he doesn't actually explain this. He just points out that carbon dating works up to 55,000 years and then pretends like that's perfectly fine with a 6,000-year-old Earth, because we have 50,000-year-old things that are verifiably 50,000 years old on a 6,000-year-old Earth, and that's okay, I guess?
Essentially, nothing of evolutionary significance is believed to have occurred in this short time frame.
That's not true at all. Well, I suppose it depends how you're defining significant, but human evolution hit a bunch of important milestones in that time period. The mutation that allows us to drink milk without getting sick, for instance, is only about 11,000 years old. Populations of people who depend on free diving for their livelihood have developed larger spleens, a development that allows their blood to stay oxygenated for much longer while holding their breath. The average spleen size among the Bajau people of Indonesia is about 50% larger than for people who don't basically live off free diving, a development that has likely happened in just the last few thousand years. But of course, these are the kinds of things that creationists dismiss as just being microevolution, completely ignoring the fact that these are the exact kinds of gradual changes that add up to bigger changes down the road.
The most commonly used radiometric dating, methods for dating geological specimens are potassium argon, or uranium lead, or strontium to rubidium. All 3 of these decay processes have half-lives measured in billions of years.
Okay, there you go. So yeah, we have reliable dating methods that can get us back to millions and billions of years. So the Earth is not young. We win.
But again, none of these methods can be used directly on fossils or the sedimentary rock in which fossils are found.
They can be used on the sedimentary rock. It will just be dating the individual grains of rock rather than dating the rock as a whole, because sedimentary rock is, by its nature, made up of a bunch of smaller rocks. Since radiometric dating methods give us the date of the last time the rock was molten, dating a sedimentary rock whose constituent grains did not have to become molten in order to form that rock will tell us when they formed as part of the igneous rock that eventually broke down to become a part of this sedimentary rock, rather than giving us the date for that sedimentary rock layer itself. This can actually be quite helpful, as a sedimentary layer cannot be older than its youngest grain, so we can put time constraints on the formation of a sedimentary layer. But also, you're wording things in a very slippery manner here. Technically, what you said is mostly true, but it leaves out the part where we can directly date igneous layers with these methods, and there are types of sedimentary layers that can be directly dated with radiometric methods, like volcanic ash. Because volcanic ash is formed in a volcano, it is igneous rock, but because of how it falls, it behaves like a sedimentary rock. As geologists are sometimes fond of saying, it's igneous when it goes up and sedimentary when it comes down. So if a fossil is buried in volcanic ash, we can directly date the ash layer. But also, you seem to be obsessing with fossils here. We can't directly date the fossils using these radiometric methods, which isn't entirely true, it can be done in some instances, but even if I grant that, you're ignoring the fact that our dating methods for igneous rock layers can accurately measure ages into the billions of years, and we have found zircon crystals that are over 4 billion years old. So, fossils be damned, the Earth is old, which leaves us with plenty of time for evolution to happen, even if we could never be sure of the precise ages of the various fossils.
So, all radiometric dating, with the exception of carbon dating, must be done on igneous rocks, which are rocks solidified from a molten state, such as lava.
Oh, okay. I wasn't expecting him to actually admit that at this point, but here we are. Now, how does that square with the young Earth?
And these radiometric clocks begin keeping time when the molten rock solidifies. Since fossils are rarely found in igneous rocks, one can only date lava flows that are occasionally found between layers of sedimentary rock.
Yes, and then we use relative dating to work out the rest.
But the problem with all radiometric clocks is that their accuracy critically depends on several starting assumptions that are largely unknowable.
Okay, I don't think he's going to do it, so I'm just going to pop in here to talk about isochron dating as a method of checking these assumptions. The main assumptions that creationists are concerned with are the possibility that there was some of the daughter isotope already present when the rock formed, or that the rock could at some point have been contaminated with more of the parent or daughter isotope. These are two valid concerns. Isochron dating takes care of these assumptions. It's when you use a radiometric dating method where the daughter isotope that results from radiometric decay also has a stable non-radiogenic isotope. So for instance, rubidium-87 decays into strontium-87, another isotope of strontium is strontium-86, which is stable and is not the result of any radioactive decay chain, hence non-radiogenic. When a mineral is forming, it does not discriminate between the different isotopes of the same element. So if there's any strontium present when the rock is forming, strontium-86 and strontium-87 will both be included in the rock at the same ratio that they existed in that environment. So if when the rocks are forming there are 5 particles of strontium-87 for every particle of strontium-86, then the rock that forms will begin its life with 5 parts strontium-87 for every 1 part strontium-86. I have no idea if this is a realistic ratio or not, I'm just using it as an example. So millions of years later, scientists measure the age of the rock using rubidium-strontium dating, comparing how much rubidium-87 there is to how much strontium-87 there is, and calculating the age. But there was already some strontium-87 at the beginning. Okay, so scientists will take several samples from the same strata, and compare the ratio of strontium-87 to strontium-86, and the ratio of rubidium-87 to strontium-86 for each sample. They will then plot these ratios on a graph known as an isochron diagram, and because the amount of strontium-86 will have remained constant throughout the rock's life, these ratios will form a linear pattern on the graph, as long as there has been no contamination. A contamination of any of these 3 elements will result in a non-linear graph, because contamination would be extremely unlikely to happen in the same amounts in every sample from that layer. So it's essentially a self-correcting calculation at this point. For a more detailed explanation, including example graphs and a reference to the cha-cha slide, see my Evidence for Evolution dating methods video.
That one or more of these assumptions are often invalid is obvious from the published radiometric dates, to say nothing of the unpublished dates, found in the literature.
I assume that when he's talking about the published dates, he's talking about things like lava flows where xenoliths are dated and found to be older than the lava flow, on account of them being xenoliths, which are rocks that didn't melt into the flow and so are necessarily older than the flow. That's a favorite creationist trick. Show that we can date xenoliths from a lava flow of known age to older than we know the lava flow is, and then act as if all the dates from these xenoliths came from scientists attempting to date the flow itself, using methods that wouldn't be accurate for such a young flow anyway. As far as the not to mention the unpublished dates quip goes, I'm not sure what that's referring to, except to guess that this is him accusing scientists of choosing not to publish dates that they don't like. I'd need to see an example of such a practice, but of course this is just one of those places where creationists like to assert things without anything to back up their claims.
So, why are dating methods often inaccurate? Well, it's because it's become something of a dating game, in which only the evolutionary correct are allowed to play.
Okay, but you literally pointed out several times throughout this video that we can directly date igneous rocks, and you glossed over the fact that carbon dating is one of the most accurate dating methods there is, which goes back tens of thousands of years longer than it should be able to if young Earth creation is correct. You didn't even get into explaining why you think these dating methods are inaccurate, you just heavily implied that scientists don't publish the data that they don't like without providing anything that would support such a conclusion. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Victor de Jong. I assume I'm saying that right, that the J is supposed to be a Y sound, otherwise it's Victor de Jong, who says, "The argument from the second law of thermodynamics is refuted with every breath it is uttered with." Right? In order to make the argument against evolution using thermodynamics, you have to ignore the fact that the entropy always increases thing only applies to isolated systems. If it were just generally applicable to everything, then literally no process of life, including breathing and talking, would be possible. Thanks for watching. Remember to head on over to vicerhino.com/donate to help with my annual holiday fundraiser for Project Share. I set up the fundraiser through an organization called Canada Helps, so because you're giving directly through them, you get a tax receipt, and I never see a penny of your money. It goes straight to Project Share. As of this recording, I've only just launched the fundraiser, and we've got quite a ways to go, but if it keeps growing at this rate, I'll definitely have to put in my $250 match donation by the time you're seeing this video. Future Rhino cutting in, I did indeed have to put in my $250 match donation within minutes of me recording that I hadn't yet put in my $250 match donation, so well done, let's keep up the pace. Just pretend I'm a time traveler here, from the past, before I know how awesome you all have been during this week. And if you haven't been awesome, then you're making the baby Jesus cry. Wait a minute, no, you're atheist. That might be a good thing. Okay, if you give to a charity fundraiser run by an atheist, that'll make the baby Jesus cry, since he's a character in a book that literally says that all atheists are incapable of doing good things. So donate to charity through my fundraiser to make the baby Jesus cry. That's how we'll win the war on Christmas. Thanks to this week's PayPal hero, Patrick. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jeffrey Dahmer, Mark McManus, Mark Hedgeham, Clint Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, and all the rest, who are the volcanic ash that dates the fossil that is my channel. If you'd like to be igneous on your way up but sedimentary on your way down, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/vicerhino. But if you only have the $1 and it's a choice between me and Project Share, give it to Project Share. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects like my podcast with my daughter can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!